You have been in that room, the one where someone less qualified than you walked out with the deal, the promotion, the respect. You knew more, you worked harder, you prepared better, and still, they won. Here is what nobody told you. They did not win because they were smarter. They won because they communicated smarter. And those are two completely different things. Most people spend years building skills, knowledge, and ambition, then lose everything in the moment it matters because they cannot translate any of it into words that move people. This book argues that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is not a talent gap. It is a communication gap. And the terrifying part, almost nobody is teaching you how to close it. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why the smartest person in the room is rarely the most influential one, and what to do about it. But before we get to influence, we need to talk about something that happens before you ever open your mouth. Something most people completely skip. And skipping it is why most communication falls flat before it even starts. Let's go back to basics. Not the basics they teach in school, the real ones. Communication does not begin when you speak. It begins in your mind, long before any words form. And if the thinking underneath is rushed, scattered, or emotionally hijacked, everything that comes out will carry that same chaos. Think about the last time you said something you immediately regretted. Or the last time you walked away from a conversation thinking, that is not what I meant at all. That is not a word problem. That is a mind problem. The first mental shift this book demands is clarity of intention. Before any conversation, important or casual, ask yourself one question. What am I actually trying to communicate right now? Most people never ask it. They just start talking. And talking without intention is like driving without a destination. You move, but you go nowhere useful. The second shift is emotional regulation. And this one is where most ambitious people crash hardest. Here's why. When you're anxious, you over-explain. You add sentence after sentence trying to cover every possible objection before it is raised. The listener feels the panic underneath and loses confidence in you. When your ego is activated, you over-defend. You turn every pushback into a battle, and suddenly the conversation is no longer about the idea, it's about who is right. When you're angry, you over-attack. You say things designed to wound rather than solve, and the relationship takes damage that sometimes never fully heals. Great communicators do not eliminate emotion, they process it. They step back internally, identify what is happening, and then choose how to express it. That choice, that tiny pause between feeling and speaking, is where real communication power lives. Now, here is where it gets interesting and a little uncomfortable. Every conversation you've ever had was shaped by something invisible, something neither person talked about, something that decided whether the interaction felt cooperative or combative, open or defensive, safe or threatening. It is called a frame. A frame is the psychological container your words arrive in. It is the invisible context that tells the listener how to interpret everything you say. And here is the part that should wake you up. You are always setting a frame. The question is whether you're setting it on purpose or by accident. When someone says, "We need to talk," the frame is already set before a single real word is exchanged. Tension rises, defenses go up. The listener is already preparing for bad news or fight. The actual content of the conversation has not started yet, but the emotional outcome is already half decided. Now imagine the same intention delivered differently. I want to share something I think could help both of us. Same relationship, same topic, completely different frame. The listener opens instead of closes. Same message, different container, different result. If you've ever felt like people misread you constantly, like your intentions never quite land the way you meant them, the problem is likely not your honesty or your effort. It's your frame. Here's another thing most people never think about. When your message reaches another person, it does not arrive clean. It gets filtered. Every listener carries a set of invisible lenses built from their history, their insecurities, their ego, and their assumptions. Confirmation bias makes them hear what they already believe. Negativity bias makes criticism feel louder than praise. Ego protection bias makes neutral feedback feel like a personal attack. This means every message you send has two versions, the one you intended and the one they received. and those two versions are almost never identical. The skilled communicator does not just focus on what they are saying, they anticipate how it will land. They ask, through what filter will this message travel? What assumption might distort it? What emotional history might reframe it before it even fully arrives? You don't need a psychology degree to do this. You need one habit: clarity over cleverness. The more work you make the listener do to decode your meaning, the more opportunity exists for their biases to corrupt it. The less they have to decode, the cleaner the signal. Simple phrases change everything. Here is what I mean. Here is why I'm mentioning this. I'm sharing this to help, not to criticize. These are not filler words. They are bias disruptors. They fill the gap before the listener's imagination does.
If you have ever delivered a perfectly logical argument and still lost the room, this next part explains exactly why. Every message carries two layers: the information and the emotion underneath it. People do not just absorb your words, they absorb how your words make them feel. And feeling almost always wins over logic when the two conflict. Emotional precision is the skill of directing emotion on purpose rather than leaking it by accident. Most people communicate emotionally by default. They feel something, and whatever they feel spills directly into their delivery without any filter or intention. The fix is deceptively simple. Before a high-stakes conversation, pause. Ask two questions. What am I feeling right now? And how do I want that feeling to shape what I say? Neuroscience backs this up. When you name an emotion, when you internally say, "I am feeling defensive right now," or "I am operating from anxiety," the emotional intensity drops. The brain shifts from reaction to observation, and observation gives you choice. You stop speaking from the emotion and start speaking about it. That difference is subtle, but it is transformational. There's another layer to emotional precision that most people miss entirely. You are not just managing your own emotions, you're reading the other person's. People rarely say how they truly feel during communication. They signal it. Tone drops when they're hurt. Words get clipped when they're defensive. Pace slows when they're overwhelmed. A person nodding quickly is not always agreeing. They may be trying to escape. A smile in a tense moment is not always comfort. It's often camouflage. If you're only responding to what people say and not to what they're feeling, you're having half a conversation. Now let's talk about something that sounds simple, but most educated, ambitious people get completely wrong: speaking clearly. The impulse to sound smart is one of the most quietly destructive forces in communication. It leads people to use complex language, long explanations, and layered sentences, believing that sophistication signals credibility. It doesn't. It signals insecurity. Real credibility comes from the ability to take something complex and make it immediately graspable. That requires deeper understanding, not less. Anyone can complicate an idea. Only someone who truly understands it can make it feel simple without losing its meaning. Clarity has four enemies: verbal clutter, words like sort of, kind of, basically, you know, that soften your message until it dissolves; ambiguity, vague phrases like "we'll handle it later," that force the listener to fill the gap with their own interpretation; scattered structure, jumping from middle to beginning to end with no thread that leaves the listener lost; and excessive detail, giving a technical deep dive to someone who needed a headline. The fix? Before you speak, identify your single, clearest point, then build toward it in a straight line. A single clear point delivered well is worth more than 5 scattered ones delivered brilliantly. Here is the part that will challenge you the most, especially if you are someone who values being heard, being understood, being seen as capable. The most powerful move in communication is often not speaking at all. Listening is not the absence of talking. It is an active, strategic skill that most people have never actually developed. Because real listening is not waiting for your turn. It is not mentally rehearsing your response. It is not preparing a counterpoint. It is absorbing the emotional tone, the word choice, the hesitation,
the things left unsaid. When someone feels genuinely heard, not politely tolerated, but deeply received, something shifts in them. Their defensiveness drops, their ego relaxes, their mind opens. And that opening is exactly where your influence lives. Think about the people in your life you trust the most. Chances are, they are the ones who make you feel heard. Not the ones who always have the best answer, the ones who give you space to be understood first. That is not a coincidence. That is psychology. There's also strategic value in listening that goes beyond trust. When you listen closely enough, people give you the blueprint for how to persuade them. They reveal what they value, what they fear, what they're trying to protect. And once you know that, you know how to frame your message in their language rather than yours. Closely connected to listening is the skill of asking questions. Not the kind of questions that gather data, the kind that open people. Most people enter conversations planning to express. The shift from expressing to discovering is one of the most powerful moves you can make in communication. It does not just reduce conflict, it accelerates connection. Closed questions, the kind answered with yes or no, have their place in logistics, but if you want to understand how someone thinks, what they value, or what they're afraid of, you need open questions. What makes you feel that way? What matters most to you here? What are you worried will happen if we change this? These questions do something remarkable. They shine a light on parts of the listener's mind they may not have examined themselves. When someone is forced to articulate what they value or fear, they often discover clarity they didn't have before. You become a mirror, and people trust those who help them see themselves without judgment. There's also a strategic use of questions in persuasion. When you guide someone to a conclusion through questions rather than arguments, they feel ownership over the answer, and people almost never fight their own ideas. The sequence matters. Start light, build depth. Don't open with the question that requires the most vulnerability. Create safety first. Safety precedes disclosure. Disclosure precedes trust. Trust precedes influence. Before words, before questions, before any of the strategies we've covered, there's something the listener is already reading about you, something you're broadcasting constantly whether you intend to or not. Your body, posture, eye contact, pace of speech, use of silence, facial expression, tone. These are not decorative, they are the primary signal. Research consistently shows that when words and body language conflict, people believe the body every time. You can say, "I am confident," while your shoulders are closed and your voice is tight, and no one will believe a word of it. You can say, "I'm listening," while your eyes are scanning the room, and the other person will feel dismissed before you finish the sentence. Tone carries emotion. The same sentence can sound supportive, confrontational, uncertain, or commanding, depending solely on how it's delivered. "Can we talk?" is 4 words. 4 words that can produce completely different emotional responses depending entirely on tone. Presence is the highest form of nonverbal communication. Presence is not charisma, it's not performance, it's groundedness. It's the quality of being completely in the room, not divided between the conversation and your phone, your next task, or your anxiety about how you're coming across. People with genuine presence make you feel like you're the only person in the room. That feeling produces trust faster than almost any word ever could. And presence is not a personality trait, it's a practice. It's built by regulating your internal state before you enter the external interaction.
Now, let's talk about the one communication tool that has existed since the first humans sat around a fire trying to make sense of the world. Story. The human brain is not built to retain isolated data. It is built to retain narrative, emotion, and meaning. This is not a metaphor, it is neuroscience. Information delivered in story form is processed differently, more deeply, more emotionally, more memorably than the same information delivered as a list of facts. When you learn to communicate through story, you gain access to a part of the brain that logic alone cannot reach. A powerful story does 3 things. It creates connection. The listener sees themselves in the narrative. It creates clarity, it makes an abstract idea concrete and visible, and it creates commitment. It inspires desire to think differently or act. The structure is simple. Situation, struggle, resolution, lesson. The situation sets context, the struggle creates tension, the resolution shows change. The lesson delivers meaning. Without the lesson, a story is just a memory. With the lesson, it becomes wisdom. Stories do not need to be dramatic. A small moment of insight, a mistake that taught something real, a realization that arrived quietly. If the truth inside is genuine, the story works. And for persuasion, story is uniquely powerful because it bypasses resistance. When you tell someone what to think, their ego can push back. When you tell a story and let them draw their own conclusion, there is nothing to resist. They arrived at the idea themselves. Ownership is instant. Speaking of persuasion, let's be precise about what it actually is, because most people either fear it or misuse it. Real persuasion is not pressure, it is not manipulation, it is not winning an argument, it is alignment. Aligning your idea with what the other person already values, wants, and is moving toward. The first step in ethical persuasion is understanding what the other person values, not what you value, what they value. People do not make decisions based on your priorities, they make decisions based on their own. If you try to sell certainty to someone who values freedom, you will fail. If you try to appeal to structure for someone who values creativity, you will fail. Persuasion works when your message fits inside the listener's existing value system. That requires listening before speaking, observing before explaining, asking before advising. Then you align. You show how your idea helps them move towards something they already want. Not something you want for them, something they already want for themselves. That small distinction removes resistance entirely because alignment feels like support, not pressure. Choice matters too. Humans resist losing autonomy. If a suggestion feels like a command, the instinct is to push back, even if the suggestion is beneficial. Offer options. You could approach it this way, or a combination of both. Autonomy keeps the mind open. When people feel they have a choice, they explore. When they explore, they adopt. Now let's talk about trust, because without it, none of the skills above produce their full effect. Trust is the gateway through which all meaningful communication must pass. Without it, your information gets doubted, your intentions get questioned, your words get filtered through suspicion. With it, communication becomes faster, easier, more honest, and more effective. Rapport is trust's first stage. That subtle sense of ease that makes communication flow. When rapport is high, people drop their guard. When it is low, they give you the surface version of themselves and keep the truth hidden. You build rapport through presence first. Full attention, not partial, not distracted, full. Humans can sense the difference between being half listened to and being deeply received. The difference is enormous. Then, mirroring. Not imitation, synchronization. If someone speaks slowly, you slow down. If someone is reserved, you reduce your intensity. This is not manipulation, it is biology. Mirroring tells the other person's nervous system, we are similar, you are safe. And safety is what opens people. Then, validation, not agreement, acknowledgement. I can see why that frustrated you. That makes sense given what you experienced. Validation says your inner world is real and it matters. That alone dissolves more defensiveness than almost any logical argument. If you have ever felt like you do all the right things and still can't seem to get traction with certain people, it's usually a trust deficit. And trust deficits are almost always fixed through consistency, not cleverness.
One of the most overlooked communication tools is also one of the most misunderstood. Boundaries. Not emotional boundaries in a therapeutic sense. Communication boundaries. Standards for how you expect to be engaged with, how conversations are conducted, and what you will and will not allow in an interaction. People without communication boundaries often feel chronically misunderstood, drained, or disrespected, not because others are malicious, but because others were never told where the limits were. When limits are not communicated, they will be crossed, not out of cruelty, out of ignorance. A boundary is not an attack, it is information. I am happy to discuss this after lunch. I need a heads up before we get into heavy topics. I can engage with criticism as long as it is not delivered with sarcasm. These are not ultimatums, they are guidelines, and guidelines create the conditions for communication to stay respectful and sustainable. Boundaries also communicate something powerful without words: self-respect. You do not announce self-respect, you demonstrate it through what you allow. People learn how to treat you by observing what you tolerate. Hold your standards calmly and consistently, and people adapt to them. No communication skill matters if you collapse when conflict arrives, and conflict will arrive in every relationship, every partnership, every team, every negotiation. Conflict is not a sign that communication has failed. It is a sign that communication is needed. The first instinct in conflict is defense. Defense triggers offense. Offense triggers escalation. And once both sides are fighting to win rather than to understand, the real issue gets buried under ego and emotion and often never gets resolved. The foundation of calm conflict resolution is emotional regulation, not suppression. Regulation. Acknowledging that an emotion is present, then choosing how to express it rather than simply reacting to it. Language choices shape outcomes dramatically. Blame language, you always, you never, this is your fault, corners the listener. Cornered minds fight. Cornered egos fight harder. Perspective language keeps the conversation in reality. Here is how I experienced that. Here is what I was expecting. Here is how it landed for me. You are expressing impact without assigning character judgments, and that difference keeps the listener in listening mode instead of defense mode. Seeking shared ground before seeking solutions changes the entire dynamic. Even a small point of agreement, we both want this to work, reduces emotional distance. Once distance drops, solutions become visible. There is one final skill, and it is the one that separates those who merely communicate from those who move people: inspiring action. Most communication informs. High-level communication moves. It takes someone from knowing to doing, from agreement to commitment, from intention to behavior. The gap between understanding and action is almost always emotional, not logical. People do not act because they know, they act because they feel. Logic organizes the plan, emotion provides the fuel. If your message only reaches the logical layer, people nod and nothing changes. To move people, you also need to reduce friction. Friction is the invisible resistance that kills momentum, uncertainty about the next step, fear of failure, complexity that makes starting feel overwhelming. The solution? Make the first step small enough to begin, but meaningful enough to matter. Action creates clarity. Clarity builds confidence. Confidence generates more action. You don't need someone to commit to the whole journey. You need them to take one step. One visible, achievable, undeniably simple step. Once they move, momentum takes over. Timing matters here too. Urgency does not require fear or pressure. It can come from opportunity, from alignment, from the simple recognition that now is the right moment. When you communicate why action matters today rather than someday, procrastination loses its grip. And now, one of the most powerful and most underused tools in communication: silence. Most people fear silence. They rush to fill it because empty space feels like weakness, like they are losing control of the room. But silence does not signal weakness. It signals composure, and composure commands attention. When you say something important and immediately keep talking, you rob it of its impact. The listener hears the words but never feels them. A well-placed pause gives meaning room to land. It turns a sentence into a moment. In negotiation, silence draws out information the other side never intended to reveal. In leadership, silence makes instructions feel more deliberate. In conversation, silence signals that you are comfortable enough to wait, and comfort with space is one of the rarest and most respected qualities in a communicator. Timing governs all of this. Two people can say the same sentence and produce completely different outcomes based solely on when they said it. A good idea delivered at the wrong moment is a wasted idea. A correction delivered to someone who is emotionally reactive becomes an argument. A suggestion delivered to someone who is grateful becomes collaboration. Reading the room is the final skill. Observing energy, posture, tone, and attention, and adapting your communication to match the emotional environment rather than forcing your communication onto people who are not ready to receive it. Great communicators do not just say the right things, they say the right things at the right moment, and then they stop at the exact moment the point has landed. Not when they run out of words, when the idea has taken root. If you have made it this far, you already know something most people will never learn, that communication is not about volume, it is not about vocabulary, it is not about being the loudest, the most articulate, or the most aggressive person in the room. It is about being the most intentional. The person who frames conversations before they start, who listens to understand, not just to respond, who asks questions that open rather than close, who uses silence as a tool, not a fear, who moves people through alignment, not pressure, who builds trust through consistency, not performance. That person gets heard, gets remembered, gets followed. Some people will study these ideas and think about them. Others will put them to work in the next conversation, the next meeting, the next moment that matters. The kind of person who subscribes to Book Blueprint is the second kind. If this resonated, hit like and subscribe to Book Blueprint. Every video is built to give you the mental tools that most people pay thousands to learn, condensed, clear, and ready to use. You came into this thinking the gap between you and the people getting ahead was talent or luck or the right connections. It was never that. It was always this.